What's going on, guys? My name is Johnny. Welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to make this conference table. It's a pretty simple build, and I'll go over a couple options if you want to make something similar under a tight budget. We'll also go over cutting breadboard ends, which I've never done before, so let's get right to it.
This tabletop is 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, and made up of an 1.5 inch thick red oak. Needless to say, at the end of this build, it was extremely heavy. I usually buy all of my lumber rough sawn and mill it myself, but in this case I had the lumberyard S3S these boards for me simply because their equipment could do it much faster than mine can. Since these are S3S, there's one edge that did not get milled. That edge got cut off at the table saw when I was trimming these boards to their final width of 9 inches. Next, I oriented the boards in a way I thought looked best, and clamped them together without any glue. I then marked the areas where I'll be adding biscuits, as well as number the boards so I don't accidentally mix them up. These biscuits are added to help keep the board faces even with one another during the glue up. I added 2 rows of biscuits, and each slot was about 12 inches from its neighbor. To cut the second row, I had to flip the board over and reference the joiner off the bottom side of the board. I then took some time to think about which glue I wanted to use. Titebond is usually my go-to wood glue, and I had Titebond 1 and 3 on hand. I ended up using 1 because it better matched the color of the wood. If I were to build this table again, I would use Titebond 3 simply because it has a longer open time. After adding the biscuits and fully covering that joint with glue, I gave the biscuits a light tap with a hammer to ensure that they're fully seated in their slots. To make the glue up more manageable, I glue up the 2 halves of the tabletop first. After their first glue up, I cleaned up the seams between the boards. I first used a block plane to level out any of the high spots, then drew a bunch of pencil lines across the surface. This helps me see where I missed any spots during sanding. Speaking of which, I started with the belt sander, sanding across the grain to remove material quickly. Once all the pencil lines were gone, I did one light pass sanding with the grain to remove any of the heavy scratches. Then repeated the pencil trick with an orbital sander. I only sanded to 80 grit since I knew I was going to be doing much more sanding later on. Next, I dry clamped the 2 halves together so I can once again mark where the biscuits will go. Unfortunately, I forgot to film this glue up, but it went just like the last one. I also rubbed the sawdust from the sanding over the joint to soak up any glue squeeze out and fill small gaps if there were any. After the glue dried, I had to move the tabletop so I have access to my table saw. This top weighs nearly 200 pounds, which wouldn't be too difficult to move if it wasn't so large. Unfortunately, I didn't have anyone to help me move it. I don't recommend doing this. Always get a buddy to help. With that out of the way, I can start on the breadboard ends. These are the pieces of wood that will be mortise and tenoned on the short ends of the table, to help keep the tabletop flat over time. I start with establishing the outside walls and thickness of the mortise. Then I moved my fence over to take several passes and remove the remaining material between these cuts. And right here is where my camera died, so you'll have to trust me on that one. At this point, I already cut and attached the breadboard on the opposite end of this table. And now I'm cutting this table to its final length, taking into account the width of the breadboard and tenons that will be on this end. There are a bunch of ways to cut these tenons. I marked where the shoulder of the tenons will be and lined up my router bit with that mark. Then I clamped a straight edge, in this case the actual breadboard, to use as a reference for my router base to ride up against. I wanted these tenons to be quite large and support the weight of anyone if they decided to sit or lean on the edge of this table. That being said, there's still a lot of material to remove, and I took light passes to ensure a good quality cut. Of course, I had to repeat these steps on the opposite side of the tabletop, but I had to flip it over first. Then I laid out where I'm going to cut the tenons and marked the areas to remove with a marker. I transferred these lines to the breadboard so I can cut the full depths of the mortise using my drill press. I drilled the 2 outside holes first to establish the length of the mortise. Then I nudged the piece over to drill a series of holes and remove the bulk of the material. This leaves a messy looking mortise, which then needs to get cleaned up with some light chisel work. And I use an 1/8 inch chisel to remove the waste material collected in the mortise. Next I use my Japanese handsaws as well as my coping saw to remove the material between the tenons. I also eased the edges of the tenons with a chisel to help the breadboard ends slide in easier. With that all done, I can finally see if I cut everything correctly, and thankfully I did. This joint is on the tighter side, which is fine because I'm building this during the summer, and the wood will contract during the winter months. At this point, I purposely left the breadboard long so I can remove it easier as needed throughout the build. I recommend considering this if you plan on tackling something similar. Breadboard ends cannot be glued in place because wood movement would cause the joint to fail. Because of this, they need to be pinned in place. I mark out where I need to drill the holes and drill them with my drill press. I'm using 3/8 inch dowel as the pins, so I used my pocket hole drill bit to drill the holes since it was the same diameter, and also the sharpest one I had on hand. After fitting the breadboard back in place, I can transfer the hole locations onto the tenons using a pencil. When drilling the holes, I position the drill bit slightly closer to the shoulder of the tenon. This way, when I drive the pins in place, they'll help draw the breadboard tighter to the table. This technique is called draw boring. I also elongate the outermost holes to allow the pin to move freely side to side within the tenon as the tabletop expands and contracts within the seasons. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using 3/8 inch dowel for the pins. I sharpened one end so it can be hammered into the hole easier, and chamfered the opposite corner so that I can reduce the risk of it breaking as I'm hammering it into place. Then I apply some glue to the ends of the pins to secure them to the breadboard and ensure that they won't come out. After trimming the excess material on the breadboards and pins, I do quite a bit of sanding, moving up through the grits and finishing off with 220. I also added a chamfer on the edges of the table to give it a more comfortable feel. On the corners, I routed backwards to reduce the risk of tear out. I'm using a wipe-on poly to finish the table. It really brings out the natural colors of the wood and offers a fair amount of protection for quite a while. It's also incredibly simple to apply. I added a total of 4 coats, sanding with 220 grit between the coats. For the legs of this table, I ended up going with 3-rod, 1/2-inch diameter steel hairpin legs. These are from DIYhairpinlegs.com, and I am really surprised on the quality of these legs. They are super sturdy and they're powder coated, so they're less prone to being scratched over time. After screwing on the legs, this table is all done.
Thank you for sticking around to the end. If you like what you saw, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and let me know what you thought about this build down in the comments. I also have another video queued up for you right here that I think you'll like. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.